Henry Johnson woke up early that morning. The alarm on his phone buzzed at 5:30 a.m., but he was already awake. He had been thinking about this day for weeks. Today was important, not just for his client, but possibly for the entire county justice system. Henry got out of bed and went through his morning routine. He showered, brushed his teeth, and stood in front of his closet for a long time. Which suit would be best today? He picked his darkest blue one, the one his mother had helped him buy when he first passed the bar exam 3 years ago. It was his lucky suit, and he needed all the luck he could get. As he put on his tie, Henry looked at himself in the mirror. At 32 years old, he was younger than most lawyers who took on cases like this. His short black hair was neatly trimmed, and his brown eyes showed both worry and determination. Henry had grown up in this town. He knew how things worked here, and that was exactly why he had to do this. "You can do this," he told himself. "You have to do this." Henry ate a quick breakfast of toast and coffee, then gathered his papers into his briefcase. The case itself was simple, a minor traffic violation. His client, Darnell Lewis, had been pulled over for supposedly running a yellow light. But the ticket was much higher than usual for such a small offense, and Darnell swore the light was still green when he entered the intersection. What made this case special wasn't the traffic violation, it was who would be judging it: Richard Montgomery. Judge Montgomery had been in charge of the county courthouse for almost 20 years. Everyone knew about him. Some people respected him because he was strict. Others feared him because he was unfair, especially to black people and other minorities. There were many stories about Judge Montgomery saying mean things to people in his courtroom, making jokes at their expense, and giving them harsher punishments than white people who did the same things. Henry had seen it himself many times. As one of the few black attorneys in the county, he had stood in Montgomery's courtroom and felt the sting of the judge's words. He had watched his clients receive unfair treatment, but no one ever did anything about it because Judge Montgomery was powerful. He had friends in high places, but today might be different. Henry had received a phone call last week from an old friend who worked at the state Supreme Court. His friend had given him a tip. Something big was happening, but it had to stay secret. "The Chief Justice is doing surprise visits to courthouses around the state," his friend had whispered over the phone. "There's been too many complaints about some judges. They're coming to your county on Monday. That's all I can say." Henry picked up his phone and called Darnell. "Are you ready for today?" he asked when Darnell answered. "I guess so," Darnell said. He sounded nervous. "Do you really think this will work? Everyone says Judge Montgomery never changes his mind." "Just trust me," Henry said, "and remember what I told you. Stay calm no matter what happens in there. Don't let him make you angry. That's what he wants." "I'll try," Darnell promised. "See you at the courthouse." Henry drove the 15 minutes to the county courthouse, a tall brick building in the center of town. It was almost 8:30 a.m. when he parked his car. Court would start at 9:00. He sat in his car for a few minutes, going over his plan. If his friend was right, Chief Justice Sam Peterson would be somewhere in that courthouse today, watching Judge Montgomery without the judge knowing it. The Chief Justice had the power to investigate judges for bad behavior. He could even remove them from their position if there was enough evidence they weren't being fair. Henry got out of his car and walked up the wide stone steps of the courthouse. Several other lawyers nodded to him as he entered the building. Most of them had cases today, too. The hallways were busy with people waiting for their turn in court. He found Darnell sitting on a bench near courtroom 3, where Judge Montgomery always worked. Darnell was 27 years old, with a kind face and worried eyes. He wore his best clothes, a white button-up shirt and black pants. He stood up when he saw Henry. "Good morning," Henry said, shaking Darnell's hand. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," Darnell admitted. "I've never been in real trouble before, just this ticket. But my brother went before Judge Montgomery last year for a parking violation, and the judge made him feel like the worst criminal in the world." Henry nodded. "I've heard many similar stories. But remember, we have the facts on our side. The traffic camera photos show the light was still green when you entered the intersection. Will that matter to him?" Darnell asked. Henry didn't answer directly. Let's go over what will happen one more time, he said instead. Your case will be called. We'll both go up to the front. I'll present our evidence about the light being green. You'll only speak if the judge asks you questions directly. If he does, be respectful, keep your answers short, and don't argue no matter what he says. And you really think we can win? Darnell asked. Henry put his hand on Darnell's shoulder. Justice doesn't always happen the way we expect, he said. But I believe today will be important. As they talked, Henry noticed 3 people he didn't recognize enter the courthouse. They were dressed in expensive suits and moved with an air of authority. One was an older white man with silver hair and glasses. He looked exactly like the photos Henry had seen of Chief Justice Peterson. With him was a black woman carrying a small notebook and a middle-aged white man with a serious expression. They walked past without looking at Henry and Darnell, heading straight for courtroom 3. Henry felt his heart beat faster. His source had been right. The Chief Justice was here, probably with other important people from the state justice system. They were going to watch Judge Montgomery in action. At 8:55, a court officer opened the doors to courtroom 3. All those with cases before Judge Montgomery, please enter and be seated, he announced. Henry and Darnell joined the line of people, entering the courtroom. Inside, the room was arranged like most courtrooms, rows of wooden benches facing the judge's high desk, or bench, at the front. To one side was the jury box, empty today because traffic violations didn't need juries. To the other side was the witness stand. Henry led Darnell to seats in the front row. As they sat down, Henry glanced back and saw the 3 important visitors sitting quietly in the very last row. They were trying not to be noticed. No one else seemed to pay attention to them. At exactly 9 a.m., a side door opened and Judge Richard Montgomery entered the courtroom. Everyone stood up as the court officer called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Montgomery." The judge was a tall, heavy-set white man in his early 60s with thinning gray hair and cold blue eyes. He wore the traditional black robe of a judge. He didn't smile as he took his seat at the bench and looked out at the people in his courtroom. "Be seated," he said in a deep voice. "Court is now in session." Henry and Darnell sat down. Henry leaned over and whispered, "Remember what I said. Stay calm no matter what." Judge Montgomery shuffled some papers, then looked up. "First case," he announced. Louis Darnell, charged with running a red light on April 12th at the intersection of Main and Oak Streets. Henry took a deep breath. "Here we go," he whispered to Darnell. "Just follow my lead." They stood up together and walked to the front of the courtroom, ready to face whatever would happen next. Behind them, unknown to Judge Montgomery, the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court watched carefully, about to witness firsthand how justice worked, or didn't work, in Judge Montgomery's courtroom. Henry and Darnell stood before Judge Montgomery. The courtroom was quiet. Everyone could feel the tension in the air. Judge Montgomery looked down at them from his high bench. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes were cold. "Mr. Lewis," the judge said, looking at his papers instead of at Darnell. "You are charged with running a red light. How do you plead?" Before Darnell could speak, Henry stepped forward. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty. We have evidence that the light was still green when Mr. Lewis entered the intersection." Judge Montgomery finally looked up. His eyes narrowed when he saw Henry. "Mr. Johnson, I see you're representing Mr. Lewis today." His voice had a tone that suggested he wasn't pleased to see Henry. "Yes, Your Honor," Henry replied politely. "Very well. Present your evidence." The judge sounded bored, as if he had already decided the outcome of this case. Henry opened his briefcase and took out several photos. "Your Honor, these are images from the traffic camera at the intersection of Main and Oak Streets. They clearly show that the light was green when my client's car entered the intersection." He handed the photos to the court officer, who passed them to Judge Montgomery. The judge barely glanced at them before setting them aside. "These photos could be from any time," Judge Montgomery said dismissively. "The officer who issued the ticket stated clearly that Mr. Lewis ran a red light. Officer Parker has been with our police force for 15 years. Are you suggesting he lied, Mr. Johnson?" Henry remained calm. No, Your Honor. I'm suggesting he might have made a mistake. The timestamp on these photos matches exactly with the time on the ticket. You can see my client's license plate clearly in the image, and the light is green. Judge Montgomery leaned back in his chair. A small smile appeared on his face, but it wasn't friendly. Mr. Johnson, perhaps in your neighborhood, running red lights is acceptable behavior. But in this county, we take traffic laws seriously. Several of the court officers standing along the wall chuckled. Darnell shifted uncomfortably beside Henry. Henry could feel his client's anxiety growing. Your Honor, Henry said, his voice still respectful but firm. My client's neighborhood has nothing to do with this case. The evidence clearly shows— Do not interrupt me, Counselor, Judge Montgomery said sharply. His smile disappeared. I was speaking. Henry fell silent. He glanced back quickly at the last row of the courtroom. The three visitors were watching intently. The woman was writing something in her notebook. Judge Montgomery continued, As I was saying, we take our laws seriously here. The officer's statement says Mr. Lewis not only ran the red light, but was also driving 5 miles over the speed limit. That wasn't on the ticket, Your Honor, Henry pointed out. And it's not in the official charge. The judge waved his hand dismissively. Details, Mr. Johnson. The point is, your client was breaking the law. He looked at Darnell for the first time. Mr. Lewis, do you have anything to say for yourself? Darnell glanced at Henry, who nodded slightly, giving him permission to speak. Yes, Your Honor, Darnell said in a clear, respectful voice. I've been driving for 9 years and never had a ticket before. I'm very careful about traffic lights, because my mother was hit by someone who ran a red light when I was a child. I would never do that. I know the light was green when I entered that intersection. Judge Montgomery's expression changed to one of amusement. A touching story, Mr. Lewis, but everyone who comes into my courtroom has a story. Everyone claims they're innocent. He chuckled, and again, several court officers joined in. Henry could feel Darnell tensing beside him. He put a hand on his client's arm to remind him to stay calm. Your Honor, Henry said, my client has a clean driving record. He works as a nurse at County Hospital and has never had any legal troubles. We've provided clear evidence that he did not run a red light. We ask that this case be dismissed. Judge Montgomery leaned forward, placing his elbows on his desk. Mr. Johnson, perhaps you're new to my courtroom. I decide what happens here, not you. His voice had a mocking tone now. Your client was observed breaking the law by a respected police officer. These photos could have been taken at any time or even altered. They were not altered, Your Honor, Henry said firmly. They come directly from the traffic department's own camera system. The time and date are clearly visible. A few people in the courtroom began to whisper to each other. Judge Montgomery banged his gavel once. Silence, he ordered. Then he turned his attention back to Henry and Darnell. Mr. Johnson, your persistence is becoming tiresome. Perhaps in your neighborhood, arguing with authority is acceptable, but in my courtroom it is not. There it was again, that reference to your neighborhood. The racial undertone was impossible to miss. A few gasps came from people sitting in the courtroom. Henry took a deep breath. He had expected this. Judge Montgomery often made comments like this, especially to black attorneys and defendants. Usually no one challenged him because they feared what he might do. Your Honor, Henry said, his voice steady, my client deserves to be heard fairly under the law. The evidence supports his innocence. His neighborhood or mine has nothing to do with this case. Judge Montgomery's face turned slightly red. He wasn't used to being challenged. Watch your tone, Counselor. I could hold you in contempt of court. From the corner of his eye, Henry saw movement in the back row. Chief Justice Peterson was leaning forward, watching intently. The woman beside him was writing rapidly in her notebook. I mean no disrespect, Your Honor, Henry said. I'm simply advocating for my client, as is my duty as his attorney. Judge Montgomery looked at Darnell again. Mr. Lewis, do you think the rules don't apply to you? Do you think you can come into my courtroom with these photos and expect me To dismiss clear evidence from a police officer? Darnell stood straight. His voice was still respectful but firm. No, Your Honor. I believe the rules apply to everyone equally. That's why I'm here, to show that I followed the rules. I did not run that red light. Judge Montgomery laughed. It was a short, harsh sound. Everyone says that, Mr. Lewis. Everyone. Several of the court officers laughed again. One of them, an older white man with a large belly, laughed so loudly that several people turned to look at him. Henry noticed that the visitors in the back row were not laughing. Their faces were serious as they watched everything happening. Your Honor, Henry tried again. The evidence is clear. The traffic camera. Enough about the traffic camera, Judge Montgomery interrupted, his voice rising. Officer Parker has served this community faithfully for 15 years. His word carries weight in this courtroom. Your client ran a red light. End of story. Henry stood his ground. The law says my client is innocent until proven guilty. The evidence we've provided creates reasonable doubt at the very least. Judge Montgomery leaned forward. His next words were quieter, but everyone in the courtroom could hear them. Counselor, perhaps in your neighborhood this behavior is acceptable, but in my courtroom I determine what's fair. I determine what evidence has value, and I determine the outcome of this case. The thinly veiled racial undertone wasn't lost on anyone present. Several more gasps could be heard from the gallery. Henry remained composed, though inside he was angry. This was exactly why he had taken this case. This was exactly what Judge Montgomery always did. But today was different. Today, important people were watching. Your Honor, Henry said, his voice calm and clear. With all due respect, the law determines what's fair in this courtroom, not any single person. And the law is clear that my client deserves a fair hearing based on evidence, not assumptions or prejudice. The courtroom went completely silent. No one could believe Henry had spoken to Judge Montgomery like that. The judge's face turned a deeper shade of red. His eyes narrowed as he stared at Henry. Mr. Johnson, he said in a dangerously quiet voice, you are very close to being held in contempt. Very close indeed. Just then, Henry noticed a court officer approaching the judge's bench. The officer leaned close to Judge Montgomery and whispered something in his ear. The court officer's whisper seemed to last forever. Judge Montgomery's face changed as he listened. His eyes widened slightly. The redness in his cheeks faded. He straightened his back and adjusted his black robe. Henry watched this change with interest. He had been in Judge Montgomery's courtroom many times before, but he had never seen the judge look surprised or uncertain. Something important had just happened. Judge Montgomery cleared his throat. We will take a brief recess, he announced. Court will resume in 15 minutes. Without another word, he stood up and left the courtroom through the side door. The court officer who had whispered to him followed quickly. As soon as the judge was gone, the courtroom filled with whispers. People were confused. Judge Montgomery rarely took sudden breaks like this, especially in the middle of a case. Henry turned to Darnell. You did well, he said quietly. Stay strong. Something is happening. Darnell nodded. What do you think that officer told him? The judge looked like he saw a ghost. Henry glanced back at the last row. The three visitors were talking quietly, among themselves. The woman was still writing in her notebook. I think Judge Montgomery just found out he has some important visitors, Henry said. Some of the other people waiting for their cases left the courtroom to get water or use the bathroom, but Henry and Darnell stayed in their seats. Henry wanted to be ready when Judge Montgomery returned. Near the front door of the courtroom, two court officers were talking quietly. Henry could hear parts of their conversation. Chief Justice Peterson himself, Judicial Review Committee, never seen the judge look so shocked. Henry smiled to himself. His plan was working. The whispers confirmed what he had hoped. Judge Montgomery now knew that the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court was watching him. After exactly 15 minutes, the side door opened again, and Judge Montgomery returned. He looked different now. His face was calm and professional. He sat down at his bench and looked out at the courtroom with a neutral expression. "Court is back in session," he announced. "We will continue with the case of Lewis Darnell." Henry and Darnell stood up again and faced the judge. Judge Montgomery looked at the photos from the traffic camera that were still on his desk. He examined them carefully, much more carefully than he had before. "Mr. Johnson," the judge said, his voice, now polite and formal, "these traffic camera photos do indeed show the light was green when your client entered the intersection. The timestamp matches the time on the ticket." Henry was surprised by this sudden change, but he didn't show it. "Yes, Your Honor. That's what we've been trying to explain." Judge Montgomery nodded. "I see that now. It appears there may have been a misunderstanding." He looked at Darnell. "Mr. Lewis, I apologize for any confusion. Based on this evidence, I am dismissing the charges against you." The courtroom was completely silent. Everyone was shocked. Judge Montgomery never changed his mind, and he certainly never apologized to anyone. Darnell looked at Henry, unsure what to say. Henry gave him a small nod. "Thank you, Your Honor," Darnell said. Judge Montgomery looked uncomfortable. "Is there anything else, Mr. Johnson?" "No, Your Honor. We thank the court for its fair consideration of the evidence." Henry put a gentle hand on Darnell's shoulder, and they turned to walk back to their seats. As they did, a voice spoke from the back of the courtroom. "Actually, I have something to add." Everyone turned to look. The silver-haired man in the last row stood up. He was tall and had a commanding presence. Now that he was standing, several people in the courtroom gasped as they recognized him. "Chief Justice Peterson," Judge Montgomery said, his voice suddenly nervous. "I didn't realize you were visiting our courthouse today." Chief Justice Sam Peterson walked slowly down the center aisle toward the front of the courtroom. The woman with the notebook and the other man followed him. "That was the point, Richard," Chief Justice Peterson said. "This is an unannounced visit. We're conducting reviews of courtrooms throughout the state." His voice was friendly but firm. "Please continue with your cases as you normally would. Don't let our presence disturb your usual process." Judge Montgomery swallowed hard. "Of course, Chief Justice." Chief Justice Peterson turned to look at Henry and Darnell. "I'm interested in this case. Would you mind if we discuss it a bit more?" "Not at all, Your Honor," Henry replied. Chief Justice Peterson turned back to Judge Montgomery. "Judge Montgomery, I noticed that before the recess you seemed to be dismissing the traffic camera evidence without much consideration. You also made several comments about the defendant's and his attorney's neighborhood. Could you explain your thinking?" The courtroom was silent again. Everyone was watching Judge Montgomery, waiting for his answer. The judge looked uncomfortable. I was simply trying to maintain order in my courtroom, Chief Justice. Sometimes I need to be firm to keep things moving efficiently." Chief Justice Peterson nodded, but his expression showed he wasn't convinced. "And the comments about neighborhoods?" Judge Montgomery shifted in his seat. "Just a figure of speech, Your Honor. No offense intended." The woman with the notebook stepped forward. "Judge Montgomery, I'm Lisa Washington from the Judicial Conduct Committee. We've received 17 complaints about similar comments in your courtroom over the past year. Do you make these kinds of figures of speech often?" Judge Montgomery's face paled. I treat everyone fairly in my courtroom, Ms. Washington." The third visitor spoke now. "I'm Gary Franklin, civil rights attorney and member of the state's Judicial Review Task Force. I've been sitting here all morning, Judge Montgomery, and I've observed that you speak quite differently to white defendants and attorneys than you do to black defendants and attorneys. Would you care to explain that pattern?" Judge Montgomery looked trapped. He glanced around the courtroom, but found no allies. Even the court officers who had laughed with him earlier were looking away, not wanting to be associated with his behavior now. "I don't believe there is any such pattern," Judge Montgomery said stiffly. "Perhaps you misunderstood what you were seeing." Chief Justice Peterson turned to address the entire courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, part of our judicial system's strength comes from its transparency and fairness. When those qualities are compromised, the entire system suffers." He turned back to Judge Montgomery. "We'll be staying for the remainder of today's cases, Judge." Please proceed as you normally would." With that, Chief Justice Peterson and his colleagues went back to their seats in the last row. But now everyone in the courtroom knew who they were. Judge Montgomery called the next case, but his voice was not as confident as before. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled his papers. Henry and Darnell returned to their seats. Darnell leaned over to Henry. "Did you know they would be here today?" he whispered. Henry smiled slightly. "I had a tip that they might be visiting. I didn't know for sure. So that's why you took my case? To show them how Judge Montgomery really acts?" Henry nodded. "Partly, but also because you deserve justice, Darnell. Everyone does." They sat quietly and watched as Judge Montgomery called the next case. A young white woman approached with her attorney. Henry noticed immediately that Judge Montgomery spoke to her with respect and patience, very different from how he had treated Darnell before the recess. Throughout the rest of the morning, Henry and Darnell stayed in the courtroom and watched. Case after case, Judge Montgomery was polite and fair to everyone, but everyone could see it wasn't natural for him. His smile was forced. His politeness seemed fake. And whenever he looked at the back row, a flash of worry crossed his face. As the morning session ended, Chief Justice Peterson approached Henry and Darnell. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "would you and your client be willing to speak with us privately? We'd like to hear more about your experiences in this courtroom." "Of course, Chief Justice," Henry replied. "We'd be happy to." As they left the courtroom, together Henry saw Judge Montgomery watching them with a worried expression. The judge who had laughed at a black man just hours ago was now the one who looked afraid. Chief Justice Peterson led Henry and Darnell to a small conference room down the hall from the courtroom. Lisa Washington and Gary Franklin followed them. The room had a large wooden table with several chairs around it. There was a window that looked out onto the courthouse lawn. "Please sit down," Chief Justice Peterson said, gesturing to the chairs. Henry and Darnell sat on one side of the table. The three visitors sat across from them. Lisa Washington placed her notebook on the table and opened it. "First, I want to thank you both for speaking with us," Chief Justice Peterson began. "What we saw in that courtroom today was troubling." Henry nodded. "What you saw today was mild compared to Judge Montgomery's usual behavior, Chief Justice." Lisa Washington flipped through her notebook. "We've received multiple complaints about Judge Montgomery over the past 2 years, but complaints alone are not enough for a formal investigation. We needed to see his behavior for ourselves." "And we certainly did," Gary Franklin added. His expression was serious. "Those comments about your neighborhood were clearly racially motivated, and the way he dismissed evidence without proper consideration violates basic judicial standards." Chief Justice Peterson looked at Darnell. "Mr. Lewis, how did you feel in that courtroom before Judge Montgomery knew we were present?" Darnell thought for a moment before answering. "Honestly, I felt like I didn't matter. Like my side of the story wasn't important. Like I was already guilty just because of who I am." "And this was your first time in Judge Montgomery's courtroom?" Lisa Washington asked. "Yes, ma'am," Darnell replied. "But my brother had a case with him last year. He told me what to expect. He said Judge Montgomery treats all black people the same way, like we're lying or trying to get away with something." Lisa wrote something in her notebook. "And Mr. Johnson," she said, turning to Henry, "you've appeared before Judge Montgomery before?" "Many times," Henry replied. "I've been practicing law in this county for 3 years. Judge Montgomery handles most of the cases here." "And has he always behaved this way?" Chief Justice Peterson asked. Henry nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. He's known for it. Most black defendants try to get their cases moved to a different judge if possible. But that's not always an option. And some attorneys won't even take cases that will go before him if the client is black." Gary Franklin frowned. "That's a serious access to justice issue." "It is," Henry agreed. "But until now, no one felt they could do anything about it." "Judge, Montgomery has powerful friends in the county. People who complain about him often find themselves facing other problems. Delayed permits for their businesses, suddenly getting traffic tickets, that sort of thing. That's retaliation, Lisa, Washington said sharply, writing more notes. And highly illegal. Chief Justice Peterson's expression was grave. Mr. Johnson, when you took this case, did you know we would be visiting today? Henry hesitated. He didn't want to get his friend at the state Supreme Court in trouble for giving him the tip, but he also needed to be honest. I heard a rumor that there might be an unannounced visit to our courthouse, he said carefully. I didn't know for sure that it would be today, or that you personally would be here, Chief Justice. Chief Justice Peterson nodded. I understand, and I appreciate your discretion. He looked at Darnell. Mr. Lewis, your case today served an important purpose, but I want to be clear. You were treated unfairly, and that is never acceptable, regardless of whether it exposed a larger problem. Thank you, sir, Darnell said. I'm just glad the charges were dismissed. I need a clean record for my job at the hospital. You're a healthcare worker? Lisa Washington asked. Yes, ma'am. I'm a nurse in the emergency room. Been doing it for 5 years now. Essential work, Gary Franklin said with respect in his voice, especially these past few years. There was a knock on the door. A young woman poked her head in. Chief Justice, Judge Montgomery is asking to speak with you. He says it's urgent. Chief Justice Peterson sighed. I'm sure it is. Tell him I'll meet with him after lunch. He turned back to Henry and Darnell. I suspect Judge Montgomery is very concerned about what happens next. What does happen next? Henry asked. Lisa Washington closed her notebook. Based on what we observed today combined with the previous complaints, we have enough evidence to open a formal investigation into Judge Montgomery's conduct. The investigation will be thorough, Gary Franklin added. We'll review recordings of his past cases, interview other attorneys and defendants who have appeared in his courtroom, and analyze his pattern of rulings. If the investigation confirms what we saw today, there will be serious consequences, Chief Justice Peterson said. A judge who shows bias has no place on the bench. Darnell looked surprised. You mean he could lose his job, just like that? Not just like that, Chief Justice Peterson explained. There's a process, but yes, a judge can be removed for misconduct. The judicial system must be fair to work properly. They talked for a while longer. Henry and Darnell shared more of their experiences with Judge Montgomery. Lisa Washington took many notes. When they were finished, Chief Justice Peterson stood up. Thank you both for your time and your honesty, he said. What happens in our courtrooms affects people's lives in profound ways. It's essential that we address problems when we find them. As they were about to leave the conference room, the door opened. Judge Montgomery stood there. His face was pale, and he looked worried. He seemed surprised to see Henry and Darnell in the room. Chief Justice, he said quickly, ignoring the others, I need to speak with you privately. Chief Justice Peterson's expression was cool. Judge Montgomery, I was planning to meet with you after lunch. Please, Judge Montgomery said. His voice was almost desperate. This is my career we're talking about. Chief Justice Peterson nodded to Henry and Darnell. Thank you again for your time. You're free to go. Henry and Darnell stood up and headed for the door. As they passed Judge Montgomery, the judge finally looked at them. His eyes were filled with fear. Fear of losing his power, his position, his reputation. It was very different from the look of contempt he had given them just hours earlier in the courtroom. Henry and Darnell walked down the hallway together. When they were far enough away from the conference room, Darnell spoke. Do you really think they'll remove him as a judge? Henry considered the question. I don't know, but I think things are going to change around here one way or another. They walked outside into the bright sunshine. It was lunchtime, and the courthouse square was busy with people. No one looking at them would know that they had just been part of something important, something that might change their county's justice system forever. What happens now? Darnell asked as they stood on the courthouse steps. Now we wait, Henry replied. The investigation will take time, but word will spread quickly about what happened today. Other people who were treated unfairly by Judge Montgomery might come forward. You planned this, didn't you? Darnell said, looking at Henry with new respect. You knew exactly what would happen when you took my case. Henry smiled slightly. I hoped. I couldn't be sure. But someone needed to stand up to him, and it had to be done when the right people were watching. Darnell shook his head in amazement. I came to you about a simple traffic ticket. I never thought it would turn into all this. Sometimes justice comes from unexpected places, Henry said. Want to get some lunch? I think we both earned it today. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Henry noticed Judge Montgomery's car in the parking lot. The shiny black SUV with its special judicial license plate had always seemed intimidating before. Now it just looked like a car that might soon have a different driver. 2 weeks later, Henry received an official letter from the State Judicial Conduct Committee. The letter informed him that a formal investigation into Judge Richard Montgomery's conduct had been opened. It also requested that Henry help them contact other attorneys and defendants who had experienced similar treatment in Judge Montgomery's courtroom. The turning point had arrived. Change was coming to their county courthouse, and it had started with a simple traffic ticket and a lawyer who refused to accept injustice as normal. 6 months had passed since that important day in the courthouse. It was a warm autumn morning as Henry Johnson walked up the familiar courthouse steps. The building looked the same from the outside, tall, made of red brick, with large columns at the entrance. But inside, many things had changed. Henry nodded to the security guards as he entered. They smiled at him with real respect, not the cold stares he used to get. He walked down the main hallway toward courtroom 3, the same courtroom, where everything had started half a year ago. Today was an important day. A ceremony was being held to welcome the new judge who would replace Judge Montgomery. Henry had been invited as a special guest. As he walked, Henry thought about everything that had happened in those 6 months. After Chief Justice Peterson's visit, the investigation into Judge Montgomery had moved quickly. More than 50 people had come forward with stories about the judge's unfair treatment. Many were black defendants and attorneys, but there were others too. Hispanic families, Asian business owners, even some white people who had seen the judge's behavior and found it troubling. Court records had been reviewed. Old case files were examined. Recordings from the courtroom revealed a clear pattern of bias. Judge Montgomery had treated people differently based on their race for years. He had given harsher sentences to black defendants. He had dismissed evidence from minority witnesses. He had made inappropriate comments like the ones Henry and Darnell had experienced. 3 months after the investigation began, Judge Montgomery was given a choice: resign or face a public hearing that would likely end with him being removed from office. He chose to resign, claiming it was for health reasons. But everyone knew the truth. Henry reached courtroom 3 and opened the door. The room was already crowded with people. He saw many familiar faces, other attorneys, court staff, community members, and there in the front row was Darnell Lewis, wearing a suit and tie. Darnell spotted Henry and waved him over. "Good morning," Darnell said as Henry sat down beside him. "Big day, huh?" Henry smiled. "Very big day. How are things at the hospital?" "Busy as always," Darnell replied. "But good. I got promoted to head nurse last month." "Congratulations, that's wonderful news." They chatted for a few minutes. Their lives had changed in different ways since that day 6 months ago. Darnell had not only kept his job at the hospital, but had been recognized for his hard work. And Henry had become known throughout the state as an attorney who fought for fairness in the courts. He had been asked to join several committees working on judicial reform. His small law practice had grown as more people sought his help. The side door opened and a court officer entered. "All rise," he announced. "This special session of the county court is now open. Chief Justice Sam Peterson presiding." Everyone stood as Chief Justice Peterson entered, followed by several other officials. Among them was Lisa Washington, who had been taking notes during their visit 6 months ago. She now headed the state's newly formed Judicial Fairness Commission. Chief Justice Peterson took his place at the front of the courtroom. "Please be seated," he said. "We are gathered today for an important occasion, to welcome Judge Maria Rodriguez as she takes her place on the bench of this courthouse." A woman in a black judicial robe stood up from among the officials. Judge Rodriguez was in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had a kind face but also a look of determination in her eyes. She had previously been a respected attorney known for her work in civil rights cases. Judge Rodriguez brings 15 years of legal experience to this position, Chief Justice Peterson continued. But more importantly, she brings a deep commitment to equal justice under the law. She understands that fairness in our courts is not optional, it is essential. Judge Rodriguez stepped forward. Thank you, Chief Justice Peterson. I am honored to serve the people of this county. A judge's duty is to ensure that every person who enters this courtroom is treated with dignity and respect, that every case is decided on its merits, and that justice is blind to differences of race, background, or wealth. Her voice was clear and confident. I promise to uphold these principles every day. The room filled with applause. Henry noticed that even some of the court officers who had once laughed at Judge Montgomery's inappropriate comments were now clapping enthusiastically for Judge Rodriguez. After the formal swearing-in ceremony, there was a small reception in the courthouse lobby. People gathered in groups talking and enjoying refreshments. Henry found himself standing with Darnell, Chief Justice Peterson, and Judge Rodriguez. Mr. Johnson, Chief Justice Peterson said, the changes we're seeing here today wouldn't have happened without your courage in that courtroom 6 months ago. Henry shook his head modestly. I just did what any attorney should do. Advocate for my client and for justice. Not every attorney would have taken that risk, Judge Rodriguez said. Many would have advised their client to plead guilty to a minor traffic violation rather than challenge a powerful judge. Darnell nodded. That's what I expected when I first came to see you, Henry. I thought you'd tell me to just pay the fine and move on. Sometimes the small cases reveal the biggest problems, Henry said. A traffic ticket shouldn't be treated differently based on who's holding it. Chief Justice Peterson looked around the crowded lobby. The changes here are just the beginning. What happened in this courthouse has started conversations throughout our state judicial system. We're reviewing procedures in every county, providing additional training for judges, and creating new ways for people to report problems without fear. Lisa Washington joined their group. And we've started a program to increase diversity on the bench. We need judges who understand the communities they serve. As they talked, Henry noticed a familiar face across the lobby. It was one of the court officers who had laughed the loudest at Judge Montgomery's comments about Henry's neighborhood. The officer caught Henry's eye and then walked over to their group. Mr. Johnson, the officer said, looking uncomfortable. I wanted to say something to you. He paused, gathering his courage. I'm sorry for how things were before, for not speaking up when I should have, for going along with, you know. Henry was surprised by the apology. Thank you, he said simply. That means a lot. The officer nodded and walked away. Henry turned back to the others. That's a change I didn't expect. People can grow when systems change, Judge Rodriguez said. Not everyone, but many. Later, as the reception was ending, Henry and Darnell walked out of the courthouse together. They stood on the same steps where they had stood 6 months earlier, looking out at the town. So what happens now? Darnell asked, echoing the question he had asked on that first day. Henry smiled. Now the real work begins. Changing one judge doesn't fix everything, but it's a start. Will it last? Darnell looked concerned. Or will things just go back to how they were once people stop paying attention? That depends on all of us, Henry replied. Justice needs witnesses, Darnell. People who pay attention, who speak up, who don't accept unfairness as normal. As they walked down the steps, Henry thought about how this journey had started with a simple traffic ticket, but had grown into something much more important. He thought about all the people who would now get fair treatment in courtroom 3 because they had stood up that day. Sometimes change starts in unexpected places. Sometimes it starts with one person refusing to accept injustice, even in a small matter. Sometimes it starts with someone important sitting quietly in the back row watching and taking notes. And sometimes it starts with the courage to tell the truth, even when powerful people don't want to hear it. For Henry and Darnell, What had begun as a fight over a traffic light had helped bring new light to their community's justice system. And that was worth far more than any case they could have won.